Welcome, novices, to the Sisterhood. I'm Hannah, your host, and with me today is Marie Claire Gould from What the Force. Thank you so much for being here today, MC.
Hi. Yes, and welcome to all Dune fans and also anyone who's familiar with my work from What the Force, primarily a Star Wars podcast. I'm really, really excited to talk about Dune Prophecy.
Today we'll be covering the trailers and some stills from the show. And what's interesting about Dune Prophecy is it's both an adaptation and an original story, and it also functions as a prequel. It's adapting the Sisterhood of Dune book from the Schools trilogy, and it's also split into two timelines, one based in the past and one from the future. It's intended to be an in-universe prequel to the Denis Villeneuve films. So in that way, both the book, the show, and this podcast are a form of transformative fiction. And was wondering if that's something that you could speak to, MC?
Yeah, so, transformational works are often associated with femme gaze and femme media, in that sometimes we like to take on stories and turn them into fan fiction or fan art. I think also just talking about in-depth analysis of a subject also follows this transformational work. But the story itself, because Brian was originally adapting from his dad, and now that's being taken and adapting. All of it actually classifies as transformational. And so when you do that, you get more creators giving to the story from a symbolic perspective, from their own experiences. And it ends up being kind of something more than the sum of its parts. And I'm really, really excited to see how that plays out within the show, because then we can tie and see more mythic and psychological motifs in the storytelling, and
Mhm.
that gives us greater meaning to how we understand this story and what it means.
Mhm. The approach that we're going to be having with this podcast is coming to it from a mythic standpoint and symbolically and psychoanalytically as well. We're going to be talking about folklore, mythology, and referencing the works of Carl Jung and those inspired by him, such as Joseph Campbell, Marie Louise von Franz, and Dr. Clarissa Piccola Estes, among others. And what I think about this is it fits so well for Dune, in my opinion, because uh, the works of Carl Jung specifically were something that was definitely influential on Frank Herbert. He was friends with two psychologists, Ralph and Irene Slattery, and Irene was a student of Jung in Zurich. So she learned directly under him, and then they taught and were friends with Frank and his wife. So I think all of this kind of comes back to the same point, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily have to be Jungian to still
Mhm.
have Jungian things that you can find in it, like
Exactly.
purposefully Jungian. What I really appreciate about comparative mythology as well as comparative storytelling is that we can find these mythological motifs, we can find human driven symbolism in story and be able to analyze it and say, hey, what does part of this mean? Why is this an important story to tell? Because Dune, much like Star Wars, has become a mythopoeia, which is that it's a modern day myth that we tell within our fiction. And there are things that are being drawn on from very well known sacred stories, as well as from just the sort of more structuralist motifs that we see, because we are all humans and we live, we're born, we die, we experience love, we experience hate. It's all very uh baked into who we are. And so putting us into the world and the extreme of Dune allows us to look at these things with sort of an extreme lens as well.
Yeah. Yeah. You've had a lot of experience with this in the past and this approach to film analysis. Is there anything that you're looking for in regards to the show that you think will be the most, I guess, imperative?
Yeah, I think, and I've been podcasting for 6 years on these things, but, like, I've been a student of this sort of way of thinking my whole life. My dad was a philosopher and also sort of a Renaissance man himself who really loved to explore these things and introduced me to Joseph Campbell quite young. I also have a background in psychology, and so I have really, really loved to explore Star Wars from this perspective and then other media. And what I'm particularly drawn to is how we as humans have started to tell more stories that are either anti-patriarchal or push back against the patriarchy. And the Dune story itself, one of the major themes of Dune is gender and who is allowed to have power and why. And that's why I'm so drawn to Dune prophecy and being such a focus on the sisterhood and the Bene Gesserit and what they represent from a feminine archetype perspective, as well as from especially the dark feminine, which we will explore as well. I'm really excited to dig into the trailers because the trailers are obviously, part of their job is to not only get us hyped and excited for what's going to be on display, but also they're supposed to set our expectations a
Mm.
lot, right? Because a successful show will use the trailer to sort of give the feeling and the energy of what the show is going to represent. And what I find really fascinating, both of us have done our notes. We've already watched the trailers, obviously. You couldn't stay away for 1 second. But what I find really fascinating is we can start to pick up on some of the sort of archetypical things that are probably gonna be happening. Some of the symbolism, especially in the first teaser, was, really, really heavy, as well as sort of some of the overall arching themes of it, I think we're getting a taste of, and so we might be quite, "Hey, this could happen," based on these things.
Yeah.
Uh, but, we'll have to see for the show how it plays out
Mm.
because the teasers and the trailers are not very long, obviously.
Yeah.
I'm very caught up
And
in yeah.
yeah, it's a way of like, this is what they're presenting to us. What does that mean? What does it seem to be insinuating about the story? What conclusions can we draw from that? And then see how much of that comes to fruition or not in the show itself. So, yeah, without further ado, I guess we should move on to the teasers then.
10,000 years before the birth of Paul Atreides, before the universe would know us as the Bene Gesserit, we founded a sisterhood, assigned to the great houses to help them sift truth from lies. We created a network of influence throughout the Imperiums. But power comes with a price. A sister on the string. Nothing is more important. And this is the marriage that makes it possible. This is us and God. We will be judged for it. Sisterhood above all.
All right, so that was our first teaser. It's short, but there's a lot of visuals, I think, and visual symbolism throughout the
Mhm.
trailer.
Yeah, like, it starts out with the eye imagery, obviously,
Hmm.
really, really heavily, also sand and water, which are, like, major things in the overall Dune franchise as far as themes, right? So, water meaning life, water meaning power, also sand power being, like, sort of a destructive force, and so fundamentally through all of these trailers, there's actually a lot of creation and destruction symbolism, life and death, and, we're gonna dig into some of that as we call it out, but that's, um, really important mythically because fundamentally throughout the course of our lives as humans, as well as, from a mythic journey perspective. So I'm speaking about Joseph Campbell, but also Estes talks about this in a particular way. Maureen Murdoch, it talks about the heroine's journey. We experience through the course of our lives periods by which we are dead or in the underworld or facing an otherworldly experience. And these trailers lean into otherworldliness in a couple of ways. So we have associations between squares and circles, which represents Earth and the other, like the universe. And the Shai-Hulud's worm itself represents the power of the universe, God, right? Like in when we get to Dune. And so having the eye, which represents the eye of God, also sort of visually paired with the worm mouth is quite a common motif in, I think, all of the visual storytelling languages of all of the versions of Dune. So they're playing into things that we're very used to seeing, even as fans.
Yeah, and what I thought was really interesting about starting with that kind of galaxy, but that looks like an eye, is that Carl Jung compares the eye to a mandala, which is symbolic of the order of the unconscious, and it's a embodiment of the universe in Hindu and Buddhist belief. So that's essentially what we're seeing exactly is this connection between the universe, the unconscious, and the eye right from the beginning, and the eye imagery becomes a lot more repetitive and continuous throughout.
Yeah, and really plugging into the power outside of the physical realm, right?
Mhm.
So that either is the power that lives in our unconscious and in, our ourselves that we can't tap into directly, or it is, the connection to the universe. Because those are actually the same from a Jungian perspective.
Mhm.
From a Joseph Campbell perspective, is when you go deep within, you actually find yourself interconnected with everything. And that is something that comes out in Dune. It is how Paul connects with the larger universes he goes within himself. So this is not something that's new. It's just they're doing it in a very subtle way, and it's kind of fun to call it out in the little subtle ways that they're doing it, just visually.
Yeah, yeah.
I also get the
Yeah.
impression that we're gonna get a lot of visions. Like,
Mm.
a lot of weird psychological stuff that's gonna come out as, like, is it reality or is it a dream? And I'm really excited about that because dream symbolism and, like, what comes out of our dreams and our unconscious, and thus fiction, is something that Ursula K. Le Guin calls the language of the night, which is how when we write fiction or we write story, it's how we understand sort of what our subconscious is trying to tell us. And I'm excited to see how weird this show gets.
Yeah, it's what's interesting is the Dune movies, we don't see a lot of the internal visions so much as like pieces of what Paul sees of the like the future and the past, but it's not as weird as it is in the books, to say the least.
Yeah, yeah, like visual
Even
wise.
the 1984 David Lynch version definitely played with some very interesting kind of trippy imagery for sure. And then even the miniseries from 2000 played with a lot of interesting ways of representing what Paul was seeing. So I think that's something that we'll get from this show, which I'm very excited about. But yeah, so at around 45 seconds, I'd say, Sarah Sophia Bocina, who plays Princess Inez, she's walking in this like red wedding dress, and over top, we hear the narration of Valia, and she's talking about they need a sister on the throne. That's the most important thing. And this is the marriage that basically will achieve this. So I'm curious if this is the specific marriage that she's talking about, or if there's some sort of
Like her marriage, like her child or something like that
yeah, like
because of
if
yeah.
there's some other pairing somehow, but for sure
This is a
this
this is a full ass child she's marrying.
yes,
Like a
this
10-year-old or something.
uh-huh.
He is standing on a box.
Oh my gosh. It's very much a political marriage. And I think it's going to be definitely a big plot point in this season. The red dress as a wedding dress is meant to be fertility, good fortune. And it's very common in Indian, Chinese, and Armenian culture and tradition.
Mhm.
And what's actually interesting is the actress who plays her mother is Armenian.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
but
Okay.
I don't know about the actress who plays Yanez, but the actress who plays her mother is actually Armenian, which I thought was interesting. And then part of the ceremony is they open this box and there's a pomegranate inside.
3 sides they
Mm.
undo, which is so cool. Sort of like petals of a
Mm.
flower, which is we're gonna get into that, but there's so much symbolism that is saying the exact same thing. Not only the pomegranate, but also the flower petals that are like dripping almost. And when they pan back for that brief second, it looks like everything is covered in blood.
Yeah. Yeah. What's so interesting though is it's completely juxtaposed to who she's actually marrying, which is a
Yeah.
child. But all of the visuals around the marriage, all of the symbolism around it is fertility, loss of virginity, maturation,
Mhm.
and the creation of children. Like, even, I'm not sure what they plan to do with the pomegranate, but in Armenian wedding tradition, the pomegranate is something they throw at the wall, and then however many seeds falls down is like how many children they'll be blessed with and stuff like
Oh,
that.
interesting.
Mhm.
Yeah, I was actually thinking they'd probably eat it. I was just thinking
Mm.
that. But, one of the important things about marriages is that, they're also heavily symbolically associated with death.
Mhm.
So this is Joseph Campbell talking. He talks about how when you marry, you, both sacrifice. Hang on to that word sacrifice because we're gonna be bringing it back up during the course of this. But you sacrifice part of yourself to the union, right? To
Yeah.
make something new. And then the creation of children leads to your eventual death as a human. These are like just symbolic things, right? Like,
Yeah.
and so a marriage is a destruction and a creation of something new in its outcome. It's also highly tied to alchemical union as one of our large symbolic motifs in our psychology for when we actually experience a transformation. So all of the symbolism of the wedding, the whole ceremony, the first blood aspect of all the colored things, but
Mm.
also fertility and union and abundance, all of that. Wild. It's wild that this
Yeah.
was the teaser.
Yeah. And, the other thing I'll say on this is that, red and white are also very prominent colors in alchemy. So I thought that was very interesting choice that bride all in red and then groom all in white.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And also sort of denotes more of his innocence too,
Mhm.
for us psychologically in sort of Western cultures. White has a meaning of death in more Eastern traditions, so it could mean both things.
Yeah. It seems like I can't imagine that this union does not have any interference or disruption of any kind. There's gonna be, I'm sure, a lot going on there. So, what this means for Inez and what this means for her groom, I am very curious. And also when this takes place in the season, because I thought for whatever reason this was gonna be early on, but now I'm like, I actually don't know if that's the case. Yeah, so
And they might do what kind of Hollywood does, which is only show things from the first little bit of the season just to kind of save spoilers, etc. But also with time jumps back and forth, we might not 100% know or be able to piece together time frames.
yeah, for sure. Because it's
Because like
going to be
even the next point that you have could happen
mm,
as a flashback, you know?
mhm,
And so there's gonna be it's really hard to pull together, like, what is gonna happen and when.
mhm. So, but yeah, I think this is the strongest imagery, and I think, in my opinion, the cornerstone to this particular teaser. And I think that's such an interesting choice for the first teaser as well. That this is the imagery that they're most predominantly leaning into to say, your first look at the show, this is what we want you to think about is all of this really vivid imagery around like women, basically about
Yeah.
femininity and that process of maturation, which I think is something that will be a really heavy theme throughout all of the characters and all of their arcs and stuff.
Absolutely insane amounts of feminine symbolism. And I would say that that is already where that transformational lens that I talked about earlier on in the show is coming into play in who the storytellers behind the show, the creators of the show are, and how they see the world.
Mhm. Yeah. And so moving on a little bit, we've got at about 1 minute, there's a training sequence between Chris Mason, I think is his name. He's playing Kieran Atreides. And I wasn't sure at first who this character was, but then after a few rewatches, I realized this is also Princess Yanez that he's training with in this sequence. Kieran is a sword master, which means that he has the same position as Duncan Idaho, aka Jason Momoa, and would have trained at the same school that creates the sword masters that go on to serve different great houses. But he's also an Atreides, which I think is interesting because usually a sword master serves a different house. He could serve the Atreides house, but what I think my guess is that he's not in line to become the head of House Atreides. But nevertheless, he is an Atreides, and he's training with Yanez. So my theory for a while at least has been he will become her house's sword master when she marries he works for that house. And that's how they meet and get to know each other. The other option that I considered was that he serves specifically the Carinos. Somehow, I think he becomes a protector of her, some sort of bodyguard figure or a personal trains her and makes sure that she's safe and knows how to defend herself. So, yeah, and we see them training and it seems very intense.
And if this does go into sort of that knight sort of princess vibe, right? We
Mhm.
could lean into you have in your notes courtly love. I was thinking the same thing, which is like the tradition of I'm in love with you, but I have to protect you. We have that a lot with Lancelot in Knights of the
Yeah.
Round Table, as well as Tristan and Isolde and King Mark. And if it leans into that, then some of that symbolism of what is being said is being pulled out in other parts of these trailers, which we will get to. And I'm excited to find out more about this and dig into this
Yeah.
because when you pull into these concepts, it's actually about following your own journey and path rather than what society and institutions tell you you have to do. So,
Yeah, I was just
yeah.
I think she's gonna be dealing with that because from what I understand, she's the heir to the throne, but she wants to
Mhm.
do things her way. And I'm not sure everyone's so eager.
We'll see what happens,
Mm.
but this is an
Yeah.
exciting thing that we hope we get to call out
Mhm.
later.
I'm looking forward to it, yeah. And then as we get towards the end of the trailer, there's lots of shots that really highlight the elements, particularly when we get to the title sequence reveal, where we have the 4 letters of Dune, and each of them are assigned a different element: earth, fire, water, air. And 4 is the number of wholeness and completion, and the elements are one of the delineations of the phases of alchemy. And um, I thought that was very interesting because it was so intense, like, it wasn't
Yeah,
just like, "Oh, there's
16
lots of fire."
letters and like
Mhm.
yeah. And so like, okay, what can we draw from a conclusion of doing Dune?
Mhm.
Each letter in this way. There's a couple of things. So when we first see the fire, it's paired with an image of people dancing around the fire, and that means it's celebration, death and rebirth, consumption and creation, all of those things. Again, tying back to what we saw in the wedding. And also it means that all of the things that make up the world create something that is higher. So 4 is the number of the emperor card in tarot. 4 is also the number of God according to Pythagoras. 4 it represents the universe from a sacred perspective, from a symbolic perspective. And so when we have it very tied symbolically, elementally to the things that make up the universe and then to Dune, it's like, okay, they see that whoever controls Dune controls the universe. It's like
Yeah.
really fun visual show don't tell.
Exactly, and I think it's interesting that they don't just, like, show the letters by themselves, they also intercut them with, footage from the show that is related to that element.
Yeah.
And I think it's making a statement that each of these elements, each of these points in the story have a meaning in that way. Um, like, I still can't really tell who it is who's in that snowy scene, um, who's, like, screaming. I did think for a while that it could have been young Tula, but I can't tell. But it does seem like a chance that there's a progression throughout the elements within the story and what each of those elements mean and how that's relevant to the story that they're telling.
Yep. No, it's cool. It's a cool way to also draw on themes and symbols to say, this is the energy of what this show is going to represent. Are you ready for it? As a teaser, just as a teaser. And
Mhm.
you and I talked about this when the teaser first came out. We were super fascinated that there was so much symbolism in the first teaser.
Yeah. Usually you would think that they would want to put something story based first so that people can like see that there's something to grab onto and get invested in. But to make this choice, I think was very interesting because that's something that because I think you were always interested in the show, but I
Yeah.
remember when this teaser came out specifically and, like, all of these visuals, you were like, "Okay, yeah, I'm in. I'm locked in.
Yeah.
Yeah, they got me." And so I think
Well,
it's very interesting that that's who
I've
they're
always
drawing
loved
in first.
the Bene Gesserit, so this is
Mhm.
like that in and of itself, but the way they're going about using kind of all of the storytelling languages that you can do, not just the plot, not just the sounds, not
Mhm.
just the sets, not just the costumes, but they're drawing on symbolic archetypical motifs. That always gets me in because if they're
Mhm.
trying to do something that also uses those psychological layers, it's going to tell a better story to us as the people who
Exactly.
are exploring the story with them.
And I think, Allison, the showrunner, she was saying that one of the main things they wanted to focus on was this being character driven and character being what grounds you in the story. So I think is if they're gonna do that in the most effective way they can, it's going to be, through these symbolic motifs and ways of exploring what the characters are going through internally. Yeah. So I think that's, very, very much exactly what I want from a show, essentially. Should we move on to the second teaser?
Absolutely.
You, you wish to serve the great houses and shape the flow of power. You must first exert power over yourself. The more influence our sisterhood gain, the more enemies we make. There was a time when you took you seriously, instead of allowing those sorceresses to rule you.
The sisterhood, they hide in your camp. They do our thinking for us.
Our hands are squeezed from the levers of power, yet our grasp is still fragile. I am trying to protect the Imperium. Sacrifices must be made.
So cool.
Yeah. This is definitely a more plot-centered teaser, which is also good, like, there's still so much that we can, dig into from there. But yeah, do you wanna start, MC?
Sure. So the teaser itself starts out with like a pool of water, which water
Mhm.
itself is an incredibly feminine symbol, and actually just like ripples, right? So of course this represents change and disruption and how sort of the women of the Imperium view themselves, and it's. I don't know what a choice to start this this teaser.
It's a very interesting visual, like, I think to me, it also made me think of the eye, the circular, within a surrounding group of people. and some sort of ceremony is obviously taking place here. And the character that we focus on here is young Valia Harkonnen. And in a recent interview for New York Comic Con, the actress Jessica Barden describes her as a very angry young person, um, which I thought was very interesting because we definitely get some hints of that. I think there's a
Mhm.
shot of her. I think it's in this teaser. It was in the previous teaser for sure. Um, and she is like screaming and she looks really mad and passionate. So we get a little hint of that, but I think that'll be interesting to see how she goes from being this very passionate, angry, intense young woman to her older self, who is a lot more
Cold,
calm, collected, cold.
hidden in plain sight in some way,
Mhm.
right? Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think it'll be a lot of fun to talk about the archetypical character life archetypes that people go through. So what I'm referring to is what Joseph Campbell referred to in The Hero with a Thousand Faces, as well as many other psychologists have talked about the life archetypes themselves. Many people are familiar from a feminine perspective with maiden, mother crone. Those are just different names for these things, and they tend to fall into feminine and masculine archetypes, but you don't have to be a woman to do a masculine archetype. You don't have to be a man to do a feminine archetype. They just have to do with the sort of source of the journey that you're going through, whether it's internalized or externalized. And
Yeah.
so I'm really excited to talk about that because it'll be really interesting to see w- what she is when she's young and then where she gets to by the time she's older and sort of trying to keep everything in place.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. And then at around 3 seconds, it's all very quick at the beginning of the trailer. There's a woman in a red dress walking over sand, which is clearly
Mhm.
Arrakis, and then intercut with a woman in a black dress walking over Arrakis. And I think this is probably part of this titular prophecy that the sisterhood is dealing with. And whoever these two women are, they have a important influence and I think um, stake in the fate of the sisterhood and what the sisterhood is
Mhm.
ultimately wanting to achieve.
Yeah, and ultimately this ties back to what we've already talked about the themes of creation and destruction. So creation being
Mhm.
fertility that we saw in the wedding in the first teaser, but also destruction being the black death, things like that,
Mhm.
right? To me like this the costume storytelling in symbolism is going to be really really interesting to talk about once we get into it to see the costumes that are used in different moments. Um, this is potentially like Vision, right? Like, I get the impression
Yeah.
this is a Vision. Uh, Walking barefoot is associated symbolically with righteousness. So, as an example, pilgrims used to walk the holy path barefoot as a sign of their dedication and love to God. God tells Moses to take off his shoes, divine presence, because he's standing on holy ground, being barefoot on Arrakis, it is holy ground. There's lots of these things that are like
Yeah.
heated. And so when you have a repetition of a motif, it is a theme. And so we're already seeing these big thematic choices in just these little snippets inside of these teaser trailers.
I'm pretty sure it's just the woman in the red dress who has bare feet. I think that's very interesting, the choice that she has bare feet, but then the woman in the black dress does not, and that she has shoes. I think that's very interesting.
Yeah, and it could be, we see the woman in the red dress and the black dressed woman later in the actual full trailer.
I think so,
Um,
yeah.
but that they come back to that. I think they're saying something about how the dirty work that we have to do, this destructive work or this very manipulative work will tie to this righteous path that they have in
Mhm.
mind. I think.
Well, yeah, it's very interesting what they do with these 2 characters in the next, trailer, but we'll get there. Um, Around the 20-second mark, we see Empress Natalia. Um, I can't remember the actress's name, but she was in The Witcher,
Mm.
And she refers to the sisterhood as those sorceresses when she's talking to her husband, Emperor Javaco, and how he's starting to listen to them. And now she seems to not have the same influence or ear of her husband that she used to. And I thought that was very interesting because the way that the Bene Gesserit are viewed in Dune is they're often called witches in a sort of degrading way, sort of like a, "Oh, those witches," and this, like, darker perception of what a witch is. But what's interesting is that Frank always called his wife his white witch. So, the perception that he has about what a witch is very contrast to how the other characters view witches. And I
Mhm.
think, the sorceress motif specifically has a very beguiling, nefarious association with.
Manipulative temptation,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. Yeah,
Exactly,
like,
and I think.
sorceresses are commonly associated with Cersei,
Mhm.
in not the HBO show, but, in, like, mythology.
Mhm.
And this comes from a place of people using the dark feminine power for themselves instead of others. And oftentimes it's sorceresses are there from a protective place to protect themselves, etc. That's archetypically what we see. They become powerful because they have no choice but to protect themselves. Oftentimes, they're a more grown-up version of a vixen or like the femme fatale well, we're gonna get so many femme fatales in this
Oh, yeah.
story. But, like, they're a more grown-up version of that who can take what they want in this. And to me, it's really fascinating that in Dune, like, if everyone despises the witches so much, like, why they hang around and why they are able to have such a place of prominence and power within the Imperium and all of the houses. Well, it's because they're probably really useful too. And people want that power. They want that prestige. They want the right witch working for them and not their
Mhm.
enemies. Because it's
Exactly.
also about the fighting. Like, we're presented with a lot of, like, everybody's getting along, but actually everybody is backstabbing each other behind their backs, much like in Dune, like the movie, right? So and on the book. Everybody is actually trying to fight for power, and I'm really excited to see how that plays out, and I'm sure the Bene Gesserit play into that to secure themselves a trusted place at everybody's side.
Exactly. And I think that we are already seeing that there is this other perception of the Bene Gesserit that
Yeah.
is already developing.
They're really new in this.
Exactly. Like they're just beginning. And so the idea of which of these perspectives on the Bene Gesserit is going to determine how they stay in power and how they gain power in the future. I think that's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. And I also think another thing that's worth touching on is not all women in the Imperium are Bene Gesserit, and so the Bene Gesserit are the ones who have this power, really. They have physical power, mental power, political power, and the rest of the society of the Imperium is a patriarchal one. And so when women exist outside of it, they don't possess the power that the Bene Gesserit do. And I think this might be a really interesting opportunity to see how those two things juxtapose and the
Mhm.
perspective of a woman who because I don't think Empress Natalia is part of the
I didn't
sisterhood,
I
so
didn't get that impression, no.
no. And because otherwise, like, she's already the empress, so, like, why do they need to make sure that there's a Bene Gesserit on the throne if there already is one? So.
Yeah, and that's also, like, something that ties into how women who survive under patriarchy tend to be the strongest proponents of
Mhm.
patriarchal values, and also are highly resistant to women who choose to live outside of the patriarchy and make their own
Yeah.
paths.
The teaser starts to get a lot of, like, quick cuts, but at 50 seconds, there is a quick clip of the older Tula Harkonnen, and there's this young girl on a table, and Tula's holding this, syringe thing above her, and if you look very closely, there's this sort of blue liquid inside of it. So, I'm wondering, I mean, blue liquid in Dune, it seems like that could be the water of life, and if it is, then that suggests that this girl on this table is undergoing this process of becoming a Reverend Mother, transmuting the poison. And it's very unusual to see someone undergoing this sort of transformation at such a young age into a Reverend Mother. So I'm very curious what role this is going to take in the larger story.
Yeah, I'm excited to see this one as well. I'm not sure what it means yet, though.
Yeah, I have ideas of what maybe they could do, but they're also very vague and a lot of just throwing out ideas. But I am curious about the young woman on the table is called Lila, I believe,
Mhm.
and I'm curious what they're going to do with her because I think compared to the other characters who are around her age, a lot of them I think are starting out in either maiden or vixen archetypes. But I'm thinking that she's going to start at a different point and her
Mhm.
trajectory will be a lot different
Yeah.
from other young women at the Bene Gesserit school. And then the 51-second mark, there's this very quick shot of a man jumping over something through something. I believe that's Kieran Atreides. And he's beside Michaela. She's the off-world Fremen. And she's a very mysterious character. We don't really have any information on her other than she's Fremen, but she was brought up off-world and she's running this or she's working, lives in whatever location this is. And later, like throughout the trailers and the teasers, we see this area kind of being raided, it looks like, by those guys and all the black masks and stuff. And Kieran seems to be here. So I'm not sure how their storylines will overlap necessarily, but I thought that was interesting because obviously the Atreides and then the Fremen and the history of what we know from Paul and the story of how those two groups come together. I think it's interesting that we're seeing now the Fremen and Atreides interacting in a different context so far back in history, 10,000 years. So I just think I'm very curious about what they intend to do with her character because we really don't know anything. And she's a Fremen, which seems like such an important character to be choosing to include, even though the story mostly doesn't take place on Arrakis, it
Yeah.
seems like. But then you're choosing to include a Fremen and an off world Fremen. So I think they have a lot in store for her and that they're hiding from us.
Yeah, I'm excited to get to know this character because I don't know, there's so many like really interesting women that we're gonna get to see in these stories, and I hope we get like some super messy ones. Michaela could be messy. Let's give it
She
to
can be
her.
messy. Yeah, yeah. I think she'll have more than cause to be messy. So yeah. At the 52-second mark, we get a close up of the figure in the red dress, and it is, in fact, Yanez, which makes sense, obviously, because of her wedding dress. And I think that her bloodline, particularly, is going to be very important to the Bene Gesserit. Interesting that it's not the exact same wedding dress, but I don't think that so much matters because I think her in a red dress is what this is supposed to.
Present.
Yeah, she is this figure, and that's how they identify her as it.
Mhm.
And I think I mean, I could throw out some theories, but I think I'll save those for when we get to the trailer. But yeah, she's clearly very, very important to the Bene Gesserit's prophecy that they have and that this vision that they're seeing.
Absolutely. I also I'm really fascinated by the costume changes to do with the Bene Gesserit and how many different sort of almost uniforms we see
Mhm,
or robes of course
mhm.
are very symbolic of service to something larger than yourself. We see sort of the version of them as we get closer to like the Dune type full coverage. We see gray, we see the veiled hats. Veils themselves are also associated with being closer to God or the other world, right? So, like, when, you know, in society, we went through a period of time where if you were in mourning, you were wearing a veil because, you're trying to keep yourself closer to uh, the mourning period and that connection to the other world. We also have the full I think they're the Reverend Mother full outfits where they're square at the top and then, like, round, and that also, like, connects the symbolism between earth earthly experience and the other world connection and beyond. So, like even even the use of black, which also seems to symbolize like I have given myself over to the sisterhood fully, right? Like being a nun, sort
Mm.
of, except some of these Bene Gesserit for sure have kids, right? That just, it's really interesting that they're playing with the commitment to the order with the actual physical costuming. So
Yeah, 'cause it
I'm
seems
super excited to dig into that when we get
oh,
to the
yeah, like,
show.
it seems like the gray is when you're, like, a novice or
Mm.
still in training, but then you wear black when you've fully become, a sister or, like, you've taken that next step in your initiation, so, I'm glad you called that out because I think for sure they're gonna be doing a lot with different points in, like, becoming a Bene Gesserit and,
Yeah.
the costumes, I think, yeah, will for sure be a big, part in
And
that.
when we see a flash of white, it's very
Mm.
startling, right? So, like with
Mm.
Tula holding, with the syringe situation in the thing, or if we see them, like even the room where they're all in black, and then they're like, the more power we gain, the more enemies we make. I'm like, everything is white in this room. This feels so weird, like. So, I'm just really excited to see what it means because there's there's the kind of like on surface symbolism of like just the use of these costumes, and oftentimes costume designers will play into the visual language of what they're trying to portray because that's part of the fun of being a costume
Yeah,
designer on a big show.
definitely. All right. I think we're ready to move on to the trailer.
Mhm.
We've never seen a force like this. The Sisterhood draws women from many worlds to advance our species and govern the future. The Imperium is fragile. The great houses fight for control. Now is the time to secure the throne and protect the Imperium. This endangers everything. The secret we've got to break.
Imperium is a circus of fear and rumor. We're surrounded by Vikings. If I lose control of Arrakis, the great houses would feed me to the worm. Your Majesty, the troubles are far greater than just Arrakis. There's a war hidden in plain sight. I'm the only one that can tell you the truth.
What do you want?
To wipe out every trace of the sisters from their worlds. It is why I've been gifted with grace. Consider me a true believer.
We've never seen a force like this. This could destroy the Imperium. We must.
I see the corruption in your heart. Same way I see the blood trailing your every step.
Talk your mind.
The reckoning's here.
I run a school of young women. We're not a threat to anyone.
All right. That trailer is so good.
It's so good. Yeah, it's doing a lot of heavy lifting to do with what we are being presented is going to be the major plot and major antagonists to the sisterhood. And yeah, it's repeating the symbolism again
Mhm.
that we've seen in the other trailers. Eye symbolism, connecting to Dune, lots of like, connecting to the worms even this time more directly. Yeah, this one really slaps. Like it's really
Oh,
good.
yeah. Um, I feel like for this one, I kind of just want to jump around a little bit.
Sure.
Um, so because I first want to talk about at about the 1 minute and 14-second mark, we see our first like really good look at Sister Francesca, played by Taboo, I think is how you pronounce her name. She's in a very, very famous actress, singer from India, and it seems like the producers and stuff are really excited about her involvement in the project. She plays, the older version of Sister Francesca, and in this moment, she, like, throws this veil back very, dramatically, and Emperor Javaco was not expecting to see her there, a little, startled, uneasy, like, "Oh, what do I do now?" Like, it shook his composure. And we know from the, initial character information that, Variety and stuff has, put out in the past that the 2 of them have a history together. And it seems like
Mm.
I think it's the first teaser where there's a quick clip of, Javaco in this room with a woman who has, like, her hand on his chest. I think it's Francesca.
I love Mark Strong.
There's definitely some sort of, romantic history between them, and her younger version is played by the actress who plays Edwina in Bridgerton.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm so excited to see her in this, and we know that she's in flashback scenes, so I'm curious if we're gonna see that history play out in the flashbacks, um, but for sure, there's some sort of separation between them where now she, like, reveals herself and he has this reaction.
Yeah, it's like seeing your ex
Mm.
time after many years.
Okay, so moving on to 1 minute and 23 seconds. Um, this is a very interesting point in the trailer because this reveals a lot, I think, about some of the conflict and who certain antagonists are towards the sisterhood. In particular, when we get into the episodes, we're going to be talking about archetypes and who different characters, like what roles they fit into. And I think for the sisterhood as a whole, because they're at this very beginning of their inception and becoming what they are in Dune, they are in the maiden archetype.
Mm.
And Travis Fimmell's character, Desmond Hart, I believe then in turn is fitting into the predator archetype.
Yeah.
So
I would
uh
say, like you're gonna probably have some sort of organization if we're gonna kind of expand the archetypes to be organizational or sort of uh cross society. There's probably gonna be some sort of group that's behind him. It's not just him. He's just the
yeah.
hand of what
Mm,
is being represented. It will be interesting to see. I do think that this insight, Hannah, is super, super interesting, and, uh, the maiden itself is all about gaining independence, from its parent or from its guardian, right? And so,
yeah.
like, even to the line that the sisterhood draws women from many worlds, it's what it represents to women in themselves is that can they take power for themselves in their own way? And I think that that's like sort of what is happening, and even into a draw to like trusting your own power versus something that is given to you by a man or by your parents or anything. So the Imperium itself is the sort of parent
Parent. Yeah.
of the sisterhood and of the
Mhm.
Red Desert, and so it's about figuring out how to break free from uh, necessarily the rules that govern the Imperium.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of because the Bene Gesserit want what they believe to be the best for the Imperium, but they have to operate outside of it, and I think at this point in time, having like, showing how the Sisterhood becomes separate as an entity from the Imperium in that way is gonna be really central, to what we see going on, And in terms of Desmond Hart, now this is getting into more speculation, but at 1 minute and 27 seconds, he says, "That is why I've been given a great power." And this could refer to a few things. This could refer to the group of army, it looks like, that he has control over, but it seems like it's referring to something else. And a theory that's been going on, and Mark from Dune Info mentioned this on the Dune Talk episode. But there is a theory that he could be potentially a failed Kwisatz Haderach, or but like an early version of that. And there is precedent for this because in Dune, um, that is who Count Fenring is. He was a
Mhm.
product of the breeding program, but he didn't go according to plan. And the Reverend Mother says, even in the movie, we have other prospects. So they have multiple things going at once to eventually create the Kwisatz Haderach. And so there's a theory that he could have been a potential that didn't work out. And so he has some of the training and some of the insight into the sisterhood. And there's something happened to him. He was discarded in some way, something. And now he has a bone to pick with the Bene Gesserit. And in that way, because the Kwisatz Haderach is supposed to be mothered by and then married to a Bene Gesserit, that also fulfills and symbolically the sort of dark union element of the predator and the maiden,
Yeah.
in my opinion. And another interesting tidbit in that regard is from an interview from New York Comic Con. Travis talks about how Desmond is searching for someone who is very important to him, and he's got a bone to pick with that person. Um, so it could be anyone, I guess, but of all the people who he seems to have a bone to pick with, it does seem like he has a problem with the sisterhood. So I'm
Yeah.
wondering if perhaps he has a history with a particular Bene Gesserit, possibly Valia, I would think.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I'm very curious what they plan to do with him.
Yeah, I definitely do get the impression that he's gonna fulfill that predator archetype, and he
Mhm.
himself will probably be classified as a bully. That's often
Mm,
where the predator sits. They're the tool of a larger power,
mm,
um, usually, but yeah, the predator themselves represent, if for the maiden, the parents, are the controlling factor trying to get you to conform with society, the predator represents this idea of like, uh, otherness by which it is stalking you and wants to marry you, but it is a different set of rules that it also wants to conform the feminine to, especially. So it's all about control of the feminine in different ways. The parents are too loving. The predator is very harsh. So the predator is most commonly associated with Bluebeard and the folklore associated with that. And so the idea is that you marry Bluebeard, but you don't know the secret by which he is basically destroying the feminine in his basement. And you have to use your own intuition to get yourself out of this situation. And intuition is highly associated with the feminine, which a lot of intuition associated with the Bene Gesserit. So I'm excited to see this because
mm,
it's kind of like, it's I like seeing stories that focus around the predator and around sort of the hunt and that idea. It's a big, big motif, inside of our psychological framework that draws a lot of people in to, explore pieces of themselves.
it seems like there are hints of it anyway in the trailer. So that got me very, very interested. Yeah.
I wanna call out, like, Mark Strong, the Emperor.
Mm,
He says the Imperium is fragile. Um
mm,
And the Imperium and the Emperor are one and the same archetypically and symbolically in story, so he himself is, now we can say he is considered to be a sick king. So either he is a puppet or he is just considered to be a sick king, like, the Fisher King is one of the big motifs around that, which is that it would be interesting to find out if he actually has a thigh injury, because that would be tying directly into that motif. But the sick king is sick because also the kingdom is sick. These things are one
yeah.
and the same. So if he's willing to admit that the Imperium is fragile, it's actually because he is.
And I think what's really interesting about that is the thigh wound is a metaphor for essentially infertility for the
Mhm.
king. His inability to continue his line. And what's interesting is Yanez is the one who's in line. She's the heir, and he has no son by his wife, the empress. And the problem with Yanez is she's marrying into this other house, and when he says, like, "I'm surrounded by vipers," and he's, like, looking around the room all kind of, like, distressed, he
Mhm.
sees a couple different lords talking to each other, and one of them is dressed all in white, and he's the father of the groom. And so I
Mm.
think the suspicion and something that, Javaco is starting to become concerned with is other lords conspiring to gain power and essentially unseat him,
Mhm.
and potentially using marrying his daughter to then get rid of the Crinos as the emperors of the Imperium. And whilst technically Inez would be empress, but would people then defer to her husband? But her husband's a child, so would they then defer to his father? And so then who is really in charge? And that gets farther and farther away from the Carinos. So then that puts the Emperor Javaco in a very concerning position where his line isn't continuing here in this situation. So that would tie very, very strongly into that sick king motif.
Yeah, I think we're gonna get it because, I mean, it's called out directly, right? So,
Yeah.
it'll be interesting to see how it plays out symbolically as well, and then I can talk
Mhm.
more about what it represents,
Mhm.
in the larger story once we get a little bit more. We get a lot of reds, whites, and
Mhm.
blacks, and this entire set of trailers, and we've seen it a couple of times throughout the course of the trailers, but the 2 moons above the planet, the larger red moon, and behind it is this small little white moon. And it's like that's, like, repeated with our small child
Yeah.
who's marrying Inez, like, I'm interested to see what's going on with that, but
Mhm.
moons themselves are oftentimes associated with
Mhm.
femininity.
Mhm.
The cycles of the moon goddesses that are in several cultures, but sometimes they're associated with men too and masculinity. So it will be interesting to see what this means, but it's a very purposeful choice to do the moons in this way and to show them multiple times that way.
That's true. That's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, I'm very curious because also you mentioned white, red, and black. Those three colors are very prominent in alchemy as well.
Mhm.
It's those three colors mainly. I think sometimes you'll see silver and gold being prominent, but generally speaking, it's red, white, and black that are the main colors of the alchemical process. So I'm very curious how visually they'll play with that, especially in the costumes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a shot after sort of we see the moons of the
Mm.
woman in the red dress sort of like twirling. And there's like
Mm.
a void of sand that looks like an eye.
Mm.
And it almost looks like this is gonna be part 1 of the part 2 later on when we see sort
Mhm.
of oh, it looks like water flowing or dust, and it's the red woman in the red dress versus the woman in the black dress in a moment, like and to me, what gets me really excited is if this is a vision, this is absolutely a meeting with the dark goddess moment.
Oh, yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
psychologically, that is super significant because it has to do with, sort of your own internal feminine power that is in the darkness. It's tied to Sumerian myth in the descent of Inanna meeting her sister in the underworld, the queen of the underworld, Ereshkigal. So it's kind of like the goddess of life and fertility, which we've seen this motif, meeting the goddess of death in the underworld. And what you discover when you have sort of these moments is that you are one and the same. So I wouldn't actually be surprised if we found out that the red dressed woman was actually the black dressed woman
Mm.
in the vision. Like they're the same person, but just in like different forms.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
it would be really interesting to see if that actually happened. It's not necessarily true, but like In myth, sometimes these things transform, and you have people like Persephone who become both. So you have Persephone, who's the goddess of spring and like new life, and then she becomes the goddess of the underworld. And so these things transform over time. And so psychologically, they can turn out to be kind of like this. But the idea is that you find out that the goddess has been within you the whole time. That's
Yeah.
what's happening. So that goddess represents your power over life and death. Think of goddesses as like Kali, who is not only like a benevolent goddess in Parvati, but also in a vengeful goddess in Kali.
Yeah.
There's a lot to dig into there with one shot.
Like 100%. And it again, it makes it look like an eye.
Does yeah.
So, like just continuing like that imagery is so intentional at this point. And at 1 minute and 40 seconds, we finally have a good look at Constantine. Um, and he is Emperor Javaco's illegitimate son. And I've had the theory for a while that he's probably Francesca's son.
Mm.
And it seems like he's
No wonder
grown
that
up
was
at
super awkward when she took off the.
yeah, and it seems like he's been at the palace for most of his life, I think, which is also interesting because he's then away from his mother and his mother's influence. And gaining influence over him might be something that the Bene Gesserit will be interested in. Um, because he's, well, from what we know about his character, he's torn between seeking his father's approval and his own happiness, which I think is also very interesting. And we
Isn't that
also
the
the only
struggle
other
of life?
yeah, the only other thing that we know about, and also the only thing his actor seems to be allowed to talk about, um, is that he seems to have a lot of spicy scenes.
Oh,
Maybe that's the happiness he's chasing.
maybe. Well, we'll see.
Um,
I mean, usually that's to fill a void that has been
mhm,
filled. Usually that's
mhm,
how that plays out in
yeah.
story, but we'll see. Yeah.
But, I'm pretty sure that he's, Francesca's son. It makes the most sense story-wise, um, to have a former lover of the emperor, and he has an illegitimate child. Yeah, it makes the most sense. But we don't really know too much about him, so, yeah, and then at, 1:45, we see Kieran fighting, um not fighting back from these group of men that seem to be under Desmond. They're like they grab him and then he just has this like face of like no reaction and then they like throw him back into the wall and he's like all bloodied up but he's like not trying to fight back, he's not struggling. He's just kind of accepting them beating him up essentially. But then these are the same guys that he's fighting with Yanez later in the trailer at 1:53. Um, and so what I theorized was that potentially what's happening is they're having some sort of secret love affair and this becomes revealed. And this is a problem because she's married. There's a lot of political investment in this marriage. And so obviously he becomes a problem then for the role Yanez probably has within court and as the heir for the emperor. I think them falling in love shakes a lot of things up within the status quo. We do see them fighting together, but then when he's on his own with these guys, that he's just taking the abuse essentially. And so this got me thinking about something that Joseph Campbell has talked about and that we touched on a little bit earlier, where their dynamic feels very courtly love, very Tristan and Isolde. So there's a little bit of a clip that I want to play that touches on this point a bit.
And then they're overtaken with this love. But Brangaine, the nurse of Isolde, realized what had happened. She went to Tristan and said, "You have drunk your death." And Tristan said, "If by my death you mean this agony of love, that is my life. If by my death you mean the punishment that we are to suffer, if discovered, which is namely execution, I accept that. But if by my death you mean eternal punishment in the fires of hell in which these people believed, I accept
Oh man, this is part of like a larger sort of conversation about how important religion was in the lives of people when this mythology came out, and these stories, and how the idea that you could choose what you desire over what was told you had to do was revolutionary. And, he talks a lot about it in his work. He loves Tristan and Isolde. He loves the troubadours. He he loved this idea of courtly love and how pure it is compared to sort of more eros or sexual love. And to me, it's just really exciting that we're sort of getting these hints that there's going to be conversations about love, control, lust, sex, like all of this stuff in there, because it allows us to actually have very interesting character conversations in regards to what it all means. Um, he- he's also, very like, so the poison itself, the poison, which we have sort of like poison in Dune, of course, like the with water of life, you're poisoned to be able to go beyond. The poison itself is actually a love potion, right? And love is the thing that causes somebody to change entire alignments, because Tristan is Mark's best friend and like adopted son, I think, sort of in
Yeah.
a way, right? And so he's betraying everything that he has ever known for Isolde and the love that is within that, because of love, the love potion that they make.
Yeah, and I think in the last couple trailers, there were some shots where it does seem like Inez and Kieran have some love scenes together, so, um, I think it's very safe to say that they have this romance that happens, and I definitely think that it motivates a lot of changing of alliances, because if Kieran is a sword master who works for a house, whether it's, the house that Inez is marrying into, or if it's for House Carino, the Emperor, he's gonna be going against either loyalty if he's
Mhm.
pursuing Inez, and the same thing with her, um mm, she'll be going against the marriage that she's committed to, that she's entered into, and she'll be going against what her parents intended for her, what they arranged for her. I'd also be curious to see if Kieran serves House Carino, if he has a relationship with the Emperor, some sort of friendship that he'd be defying, or if he works for, I believe it's House Hagal that she's married into, if he has a relationship with either the groom, or the groom's father. I am curious if there's any like also emotional connection there beyond just that's who he works for. But there's definitely betrayal of loyalties for certain going on here, and they seem to have people sent after them because of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Some sort of betrayal.
The trailer starts to pick up with its cuts, so it's very quick. But at 2:13, we see this shot of like blue liquid, and then an eye, and the eye is turning blue in the moment. And I thought that was just such a cool visual. But again, this is clearly the poison transmutation of the water of life, and based on what the rest of the face looks with the eye, I'm guessing that this is probably the girl Lila. She's probably successfully passing this, test to become Reverend Mother, and what's also interesting is that we see her in scenes throughout this trailer where there's, like, all kind of gray and misty looking, and then there's all of these figures around her that are, like, reaching for her and speaking to her, and then she's screaming. I think it's a little bit in later in the trailer that we get those clips, but I think that's the other memory, the, ancestral memory that she's seeing all of the different lives of the previous sisters and Reverend Mothers, and I think seeing that visual, like, being in her head for that and what she's experiencing is really interesting, and the water of life is, that death and rebirth cycle. That's you die and then you come back. And so seeing her physically be in the underworld with the dead is such a really cool imagery and something we haven't gotten to see with this process. Even in any previous adaptation, we've seen hints of the other memory and the other sisters, but to see all of them physically there around her is so cool. And I'm very curious
Yeah, like, shows
what
give
they're
us way more
incorporating
time
here.
to explore that as
Yeah.
well, which is great.
And I'm curious what, for her arc, but then also just in general, what information they're going to impart on her when she's with them like that in the underworld, because she seems so scared in the moment. So I'm also very curious to see how this then affects her afterwards and what she'll be like after going through that kind of transformation.
Yeah, and the eyes, of course, like, like the fact that they're changing the color, et cetera, like, it's clearer vision, it's all of that.
Mhm.
So I'm excited to see what it all means.
And, in terms of blue, and I think this goes for just Dune in general, but so there's these figurines from ancient Sumeria where, they're very prominent on the eyes, like, the rest of the figure isn't as important, but they're very prominent eyes, and they were made to be blue, and the reason for that is because blue is the color of the heavenly sphere, so these figures represented the watchfulness of the gods, and also the 3rd eye chakra, the color associated with it is navy blue. So I think it's very interesting that the way that this, again, association with God, with the unconscious, with a higher awareness is all tied into this consistent imagery within the show. It's there within Dune overall, but I like that they're doubling down on it and we see it presented in a lot of different ways. And it's something they're clearly very much wanting to explore.
Yeah, and it's repetitive symbolism again, which means
Mhm.
that it's importance, which is good. So, likelihood is we'll be like, there's that thing again, a lot when we're watching the show.
Hmm. Oh, again, more eyes.
More eyes,
The I'll
more
just have, like,
more
a little
text,
ongoing eye counter every time there's, like, eyes.
and an eye.
Boop, boop. And then, at 2:15, there's a scene happening with young Tula. She's Valia's sister, and based on what imagery we have there, I'm personally expected to either be a literal or symbolic marriage or union occurring with her character in whatever scene's happening here. Joseph Campbell described the bullfighter as the solar power and the bull as the lunar power. And I've just talked about this in threads on Twitter before. And in Dune, from my perspective anyway, usually the masculine is associated with the moon and the feminine is associated with the sun. And Paul is very strongly associated with the moon and with the bull. And House Harkonnen is usually associated with a griffin. Um, and the griffin is also often the solar power, the solar symbol. We see that play out within Dune with Thade and Paul, and that is intended to be symbolically a marriage or union. They were also supposed to get married had Paul been born as a girl anyway. So there's a lot of this arena fighting, bullfighter, union kind of consistent imagery in Dune already. And
Yeah.
so in this scene, we have a Harkonnen, we have a bull. I'm expecting something like that to transpire. And what's interesting is in this scene, she's in this forest. In the first teaser, I think it is, there's a very quick shot of a shirtless man walking out of a cave of some kind from the back. I have no idea what his face is, who he is. He doesn't look like a cast member that we've, um, seen throughout the show yet, um, but he's in the same location as her, and so, potentially, there is some sort of literal or symbolic marriage happening or union happening with, young Tula and her story arc. Um, yeah, and for Joseph Campbell, the idea of the bull sacrifice is marriage, kill a former self. The
The
sacrifice of the
artist.
bull is to start the new period. The past must be killed in order for there to be a future. And that is the point of the bull sacrifice, and
Yeah.
that is what marriage is. It's what the union is. It's the killing of your former selves to then create something new in the future together, usually a child.
It's heavily tied to gods that die
Mhm.
ongoing and are reborn
Mm.
to renew
Mhm.
the world, like Osiris, and of course it. What's really interesting is like this is like Duke Leto and his dad and that relationship
Mhm.
too, and I'm wondering how that's all going to tie in because like of course the bull is associated with the Atreides, but this is a different situation. And so it's like very purposeful to bring a bull symbolically into this situation where she's dressed
Yeah.
all in white as well. The bull in Dune is associated with knowing that you will be sacrificed for what is required, but you make the choice anyways.
I think, I mean, it's it's hard to say for sure because it's so long ago from the movies, but there is clearly a reason why they chose a bull. And like that's for one, it's so associated with House Atreides, and it's so associated with Dune. If it was just some beast that she comes across in the forest, they could have picked a bear, anything
Yeah.
else, but they specifically wanted a bull, and they specifically chose a bull. So, I think they know what the bull is already associated with within Dune, which is bullfighting and arena fighting. And even in the Dune movies, the arena, all of the attendants in the arena have these like horn headpieces even. Like I'm this is one theory that I'm putting my foot down. I think that something is happening here. I am very sure that something is happening here. Um yeah.
We just need like more information, but I
Yeah.
I like a speculation because it's
Mhm.
it's very symbolic, as we have said,
Mhm.
right? Yeah. One thing that I kind of have noticed is repeatedly throughout all the trailers have these shots of people emerging from like sort of a like an oval-ish opening. And it's at night, it's a day, like they're constantly emerging from things, and we have like multiple different versions. I don't even think it's the same place, but it's the same type of opening, which of course coming in from the darkness, you're being reborn or you're being open to something new. So I'm really excited to see how that's used visually and how it ties into what's happening in the show. I just wanted to call it out because was repeated like I think 3 or 4 times over the course of all of the trailers.
Yeah. I think well, because the other thing is it's the sisterhood and they have a breeding program. So for them, um having children, having specific children in specific ways and what they represent and what bloodlines they're continuing and for what purposes is so integral to their mission. So undoubtedly there's going to be a lot of literal and symbolic birth, rebirth,
Yeah.
dating, of course,
I
the
mean,
purpose of,
that
you know,
happens in just regular story that doesn't also involve, like, trying to rejuvenate, an entire culture and control it from a feminine perspective. I mean, we're gonna get a ton of that, which is
oh
great.
yeah.
I think that brings us to the end of the trailers.
Yes. I think we just got a couple stills to look at now.
Awesome.
I wanted to start off with this one because, um, well, obviously it's such a cool shot, and we're getting to see Benny Gesserit in training, and I'm pretty sure what they're doing here is prana bindu, which is a form of physical control that they're able to do with their bodies. It's like complete control over all of their muscles and nerves, and prana bindu means energy points.
Mm,
In I think it's Sanskrit that it means energy points. So from what I've heard, there's definitely going to be a focus or an exploration of this power. And also the character at the center of this photo is Sister Theodosia, and we see her interacting with Valia in the trailers a little bit. She seems to be, I think, taken under her wing and sort of mentored by her on some sort of mission with her. And here she's still training, and we see the older Tula Harkonnen kind of overseeing the other sisters. Also, these robes remind me of Rey.
yeah. Oddly,
Which
you go darker, as you get progressed in the Bene
Mhm.
Gesserit, the sisterhood, whereas Rey went back to white for some reason.
Yeah, it's very cool. And actually, this is so funny. I ate like years ago. I made I a fan art of Jessica
Mhm.
training at the Bene Gesserit school, and it looked exactly like this.
Oh, no.
The same poses and everything. I was, like, stunned when I saw this. I was like, Oh my gosh.
That's
Yeah.
great.
And then this one here is a couple photos. First it's older Tula with another sister. And I think they must be somewhere in the sister school.
Yeah,
But I think it's so
I've seen the
interesting.
markings on the wall in the
Mhm.
posters before, and they're very like chalice shaped, which is also a
Mm.
feminine symbol, which is
Yeah.
really cool. Okay, tell me where this Ouroboros is, because I
Okay. It's this is a pin, and they have it on all of the sisters, dressed all in black. They all have. I think that actually the novices have a different version of it, but all of the sisters in black have this pinned on their hips.
oh,
You can
you're
see it.
kidding me.
Yeah, they all of them do, and the reason why it's not like a full, um, infinity sign essentially is just because it's the fabric covers it, but it's a pin that goes all the way around,
Mm.
and it's a sandworm, and
Yep,
being
and it
partially
also
covered.
is a DNA strand,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
is super key in the book
mhm,
too, right? So,
yeah.
okay, I'm gonna save all of this till we can, like, see it in context, but, an Ouroboros is absolutely such a cool symbol. It is, the symbol of alchemical union, which is, like, their thing, like, they're trying to build things to create sort of, like, holy children, the kinda chain. The Ouroboros, of course, we traditionally, associate with infinity, right? So that's the 8 on its side, or the snake eating its own tail. But it's also when a snake is not eating its own tail, it's only destroying. But when it eats its own tail, it is creating at the same time, which is a repetitive symbol to, hey, the red dress and death and rebirth and all of these things are all tied together. I did not spot this, and I am so glad that you grabbed a screenshot of it. Thank you.
Yeah, I was gonna just do the picture, but then I was like, "It's so tiny, I need to pull up the other one because it's so detailed too, like, it's
Mhm.
just so cool, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
the fact that it's a sandworm as well, like, oh, that's so cool.
just the cherry on top, it's so
Yeah.
good, oh my gosh. And then here we have, just another look at Inez in her wedding dress. I think the cosplays for this are going to be
Oh,
phenomenal.
look.
Oh my gosh.
There's one thing
And
I wanted to point out about her face,
mm,
right? And I know we've
mhm,
seen other versions of the, like, face chains, etcetera, but with
mhm.
the veil itself, it looks like, a death shroud, which is
Mm.
kind of like death and life together in one
Wow.
person.
That's
That's
really
really
interesting.
interesting to me.
And I mean, in a way, you could look at it as she sort of approaching this marriage like a death. Like,
Mhm.
her life is over now as she's entering into this political marriage. So that's yeah, that's very fascinating, and I am curious, how the scenes work where she's wearing this face piece over top of her veil, it looks like, but
Mm.
then later the veil's off, but she's still wearing this face
Yeah.
jewelry headpiece, yeah, and it's just a beautiful made costume. It's
Yeah.
very yeah. And then next one is
Yes.
Miriam and Inez training together. And this is a very interesting photo.
Very, very sexy. You're just putting it up
Oh
there.
yeah.
Sexy.
Yeah, it is. It is. He's pointing the sword at her. She's looking up into his eyes. Her eyes actually look a little red when you're very close up
Mhm.
on it. A little bit like she's emotional or crying or was crying. Definitely lots of tension
Here for this.
within. Yes. Sexually charged fighting sequences are sort of one of my favorite tropes. Very much so. I think, their sequences together are gonna be, it seems like they'll have lots of chemistry. And I think that's all of our stills for today. Um, but yeah, any final thoughts on the trailers or the teasers?
Oh, well, like, now that we've dug so in depth with everything, I'm, like, even more excited about the show because, like, it's literally like we have what, less than 3 minutes, less than 2 minutes of footage. It's not very long.
Something like that.
Like the like that much, and look how long we've talked about all of this things for. But no, it really makes me excited because if we can even see the symbolic elements coming out in the trailers and the teasers, it means the shows themselves are going to be jam packed with
Totally.
thoughtful, symbolic, mythically important, psychologically important storytelling, and that just gets me super jazzed. I'm really excited to do this with you, Hannah, and to cover the whole show from this a metamythic perspective.
So thank you everyone for coming along with us and listening. And I'm very excited to get to the next episode when it premieres, and finally meet all of these characters and follow along on their journeys. You can find me on X and Blue Sky at Shihaya Spring. And where can our listeners find you, Marie Claire?
You can find me on most social media at Marie C. Gould. And if you're interested in Star Wars, of course, you can check out What the Force. I also have a secondary channel called What the Fiction, where I talk about all sorts of different media, including Asian dramas, because I love those. And this has been the Sisterhood Podcast, which is, of course, at Podcast Above All on Twitter and Instagram. And I'm sure we'll get something on Blue Sky eventually.
At some point, yeah. We will see all of you novices next time. Thank you very much.